When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Are you as excited about this episode as I am? I sure hope so. We're about to dive into another story-filled adventure and learn something new. And remember, by learning more about the past, you can make a positive impact on the future. So pack your bags and let's go.
How many people would risk their life for a book? In 1942, a group of Jewish scholars did exactly that. During World War II, they placed their lives in danger by secretly hiding thousands of important papers and art. Germany's Nazi Party had decided these historical documents were not worth keeping and planned to destroy them. But, to the Paper Brigade, these books and papers were treasures that needed to be saved, and they were willing to risk it all. This is the story of the Paper Brigade and its daring plan to rescue history. Our story begins on June 22nd, 1941. It was about 9 a.m. in the city of Vilna, a city that is known today as Vilnius. It was a quiet morning. Many had already left their homes for work. This beautiful city was located in Lithuania, a country in northeastern Europe. At the center of the city sat the Strashun Library, filled with thousands of books. That morning, like most days, you might have seen a line of people waiting to get a seat at a table inside the famous library. And not too far away, you would find the Yiddish Scientific Institute, or YIVO. Yiddish was the language of many Jewish people in Central and Eastern Europe, and the YIVO had housed millions of documents about Yiddish literature, folklore, history, education, and economics. Because of places like the Strashun Library and the YIVO Institute, Vilna became known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. With a large Jewish population, the city had become a hub of Jewish culture and literature. In fact, it had 105 synagogues and meeting houses and 6 Jewish newspapers. Over the past decade, many Jewish scholars have fled to this city. They were eager to study in the famous libraries and universities, and many were also seeking a better life. But lately, life in Vilna had not been easy. The city was no longer controlled by Poland, but rather the Soviet Union. In 1939, the Red Army had taken over Vilna. With the Soviet Union in charge, many people had been deported, and the government had taken over their businesses. Yiddish newspapers had been shut down, and Hebrew education had been banned. Yes, life in Vilna had not been easy, but that morning on June 22nd, 1941, things were about to get much worse. It was about 10 in the morning when the sound of sirens blared through the city. Something was wrong. An hour later, the Soviet foreign minister came onto the radio. "There has been an attack on the Soviet Union by Germans," he announced. The people of Vilna were shocked. It was the middle of World War II, but Germany and the Soviet Union had promised not to attack each other. Had the Germans broken this promise? At noon, it became very clear. People spotted German planes flying above the buildings. And soon after, they heard the sound they had never hoped to hear. Bombs. Just 2 days later, the German army had taken over the city, closing off the roads. The people of Vilna were trapped. Many of them had moved to Vilna from other countries to escape the German army, and now the army was here. For many, life in German-occupied Vilna was far worse than it had been under the Soviet Union. At that time, Germany was led by the Nazi Party. In Vilna, the party immediately began arresting citizens, and people lost their lives. Many Jewish people didn't leave their homes for fear that they would be taken and never return. When Nazi soldiers came knocking on their doors, the people of Vilna were afraid for their lives. But for some Jewish citizens, these officers came for a very different reason than they expected. As they opened their doors, they met a German named Dr. Johannes Pohl. Pohl worked for a Nazi department called the ERR. This department was in charge of finding important documents and artwork and shipping these treasures to Germany. To put it simply, the ERR was in the business of stealing. One of its goals was to use these stolen materials to study and destroy ideas they believed went against the Nazi Party. They searched for works created by the Jewish community, as well as communist and democratic organizations. During World War II, the ERR plundered institutions and homes of people across Europe. Palaces, museums, churches, synagogues, libraries, and universities were looted, and millions of works were either stolen or destroyed. You may remember that Vilna was a center of Jewish scholarship. Its libraries were filled with millions of books and manuscripts, and because of this, Vilna became a very important place to the ERR and to Dr. Johannes Pohl. Dr. Pohl arrived in Vilna a week after the Germans took control of the city. He began his work by finding the men in charge of the Straussian Library and Vilna University. Under his orders, these men were arrested and forced to hand over Vilna's rarest treasures. In no time at all, crates of these precious documents and objects were loaded onto trains and shipped to Germany. But Pohl didn't stop there. During this trip, he realized there were many more important documents in Vilna, too many for a German team to manage alone. He decided the ERR needed to return, and they needed a group of Jewish experts to help them sort through the piles of books and papers. By this time, Vilna's Jewish people had been forced to live in a cramped part of the city called the Vilna Ghetto. Life in the ghetto was difficult, but the people tried to make it as normal as possible. They had even set up a library in one of the buildings. People donated their books and art to the library so that thousands of fellow Jews could borrow books. Reading gave them hope, which was something they desperately needed. During this time, the ERR picked up the pace on their plans. It selected a dozen or so Jewish scholars for its work team. Every day, these men and women were taken to an area outside the ghetto, a sorting station and a library. The scholars looked at the piles of books with a pit in their stomachs. They had to make a choice, and neither option was good. As they held a book in their hands, they could choose to save it, knowing it would be sent to Germany, or, if they didn't save it, the book would be sent to a paper mill where it would be mushed into a pulp, destroyed forever. As time passed, the ERR began opening new sorting stations, including one in the YIVO building, and forced more Jewish scholars to pick through the stacks of books. These scholars took no pleasure in their new jobs. As soon as the Germans left the building, they would often stop working. Sometimes they would read poetry aloud or worked on their own research. These were small ways to resist, but it helped them get through the long days. And yet, it didn't feel like enough. Even if they wanted to save all of the books by sending them to Germany, it wasn't possible. The ERR had quotas, or a limited amount, of books it could save, which meant that at least 30% of the art, papers, and books would be destroyed no matter what. The Jewish work team wondered, was there anything they could do to stop this? Staring at the books destined for the paper mill, the workers had an idea. What if they saved these books? What if they took them and hid them somewhere the Germans wouldn't notice? It was a dangerous idea. They would be risking their lives, but this brave group of scholars believed it was worth it. They started crafting their plan. At first, they began sneaking books into the piles that were going to be sent to Germany. Their hope was that the Germans would lose the war, and these books would be found and returned. But it wasn't long before they came up with a more dangerous plan.
Hi friends, are you enjoying today's episode? I'd like to take a quick break from the story to tell you about another great place to learn about the past. Honest History creates magazines and books for kids that are filled with fun stories and activities that bring history to life. From pirates to spies to great inventions and so much more, you'll learn about interesting people, places, and events from around the world that made history. Created for kids ages 6 through 12, you can sign up and receive new adventures delivered straight to your doorstep every quarter. Just visit honesthistory.co. That's honesthistory.co to sign up today. Oh, and here's a special offer for our podcast listeners. Use code ANYTIMENOW for 10% off. Again, that special code is ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
Every day, after work, they would tuck books and papers into their clothes and shoes. Then, they would sneak these materials out of the sorting station and into the ghetto. And this was no small task. The ghetto gates were guarded by police who often searched the people going in and out. If they were lucky, the Jewish police officers would be on duty, rather than the German police officers. The Jewish people would often let people pass through the gates if they were only carrying paper. After sneaking hundreds of papers into the ghetto, the team of Jewish scholars got a nickname. They were called the Paper Brigade. The brigade was made up of many writers and researchers. There were the poets Abraham Sutzkever and Shmerk Kotraginsky, the librarians Herman Kruk and Dina Abramowitz, and over 30 more members. To many others living in the ghetto, it seems strange that the Paper Brigade was risking their lives for paper. One member recalled, "Other Jews looked at us as if we were mad. They smuggled food into the ghetto, hidden in their clothes and boots, but we smuggled in books, scraps of paper, and sometimes a Torah." The poet Abraham Sutzkever became a leading member of this brave crew. Like many others, he tucked books into his clothing and crossed into the ghetto, hoping he wouldn't get caught. But he thought of a clever way to make sure even the German police wouldn't stop him. One day, he asked the German officers if he would be allowed to remove spare paper from the sorting station. He explained that this paper would be used in his stove at home to light the fire. This seemed quite reasonable to the German officers. If the paper was going to be destroyed, they didn't mind that Sutzkever took it back home with him, so they agreed. Now, it was time to see if this plan worked. Sutzkever was in the YIVO building, picking through piles of documents. When his workday was over, he took a small group of papers and tucked them into his jacket. He left the building and walked quickly to the ghetto. As usual, there was a long line of returning workers in front of the gates. Sutzkever waited in line as each person was questioned and searched. Some of the workers were found with food they had tried to sneak in and were taken aside to be punished. When it was Sutzkever's turn, he showed the officers his papers and explained he was allowed to carry waste paper. The officers looked at the documents and searched the rest of his clothing for any food or weapons. Finding nothing but papers, they nodded and ordered him to cross through the gates. Sutzkever breathed a sigh of relief. His plan worked. He walked to his home, a small apartment in the Vilna ghetto. He opened the door and closed it quietly behind him. Once inside, he took the papers out of his jacket, peeled back part of the wallpaper, and placed the papers behind it. For now, the documents were safe. This was just one of the many hiding places used by the Paper Brigade. Over the next few weeks, the team had secretly stashed treasures away in the basement beneath the library and in the bunkers hidden deep beneath the ghetto. As the months dragged on, they even began to hide materials in the YIVO building itself. But in 1943, life in the Vilna ghetto changed. The Nazi leaders had become nervous that the people would rise up, and they ordered the destruction of the ghetto as soon as possible. That summer, thousands of Jews living in Vilna were sent away to labor camps, and sadly, most of these men, women, and children lost their lives. When Abraham Sutzkever heard about these plans, he knew there was no time to waste. He had to escape the ghetto as soon as possible. A proud member of the Paper Brigade, he had also been a member of the resistance group called the United Partisan Organization. For months, this group had been hiding weapons so they could fight back. Now, it seemed, that time had come. Sutzkever and 180 members of the resistance group fled the city and hid in the forests. Sutzkever and his wife were in the forest when they saw something in the sky, a Soviet plane. It flew overhead, dodging German bullets, and landed on a frozen lake. Sutzkever and his wife raced towards the plane and jumped inside before the aircraft lifted back up into the sky. Sutzkever learned that a fellow writer in Russia had arranged for this plane to rescue him. He and his wife escaped safely to Moscow, hoping one day to return. Sutzkever was one of the lucky ones. Sadly, very few of the 40 Paper Brigade members survived. In fact, only 8 members made it out alive, and it was now up to them to find the papers their team had left behind. In 1944, the Red Army arrived in Vilna, forcing the German troops to withdraw. With the Nazis gone, Sutzkever returned with another member of the brigade, Shmerk Kotraginsky. The two poets hoped to rescue the documents their crew had stashed away, not knowing what, if anything, had survived. Sadly, they discovered that the YIVO building had been destroyed during the war, and all the documents inside had been burnt. They continued on, reaching the ghetto library. Maybe the papers in the basement could be saved? But, like YIVO, the books in the library had also been destroyed. Their only hope was now the secret bunkers. To the poets' relief, the bunkers hadn't been discovered. Sutzkever and Kotraginsky opened the door to the underground room and began digging beneath the floor. As they pushed the dirt away, they saw what they hoped to find. Books, diaries, letters, and art still hidden, still safe. It was not much, but with these documents, Sutzkever hoped to build a new museum. Little did he know, there was actually much more. After the war, the U.S. Army uncovered crates of rare documents in Germany. When the soldiers opened the boxes and saw what was inside, they realized something. These papers and objects had come from YIVO in Vilna, the very same YIVO that had been destroyed years before. The crates were sent to New York City, where they would become part of the new YIVO in the United States. Eventually, the documents Sutzkever recovered from the bunker were also moved to the new YIVO, and, just like before, Sutzkever had to smuggle these papers to save them. But this time, he had to smuggle them out of the Soviet Union to get to their new home in the U.S. Today, thousands of books, manuscripts, and papers that the Paper Brigade had saved can be found in New York. Even now, people continue to search Vilnius, where hidden materials are still being uncovered. And with each new discovery, historians are reminded of the incredible risks the Paper Brigade took every day after work over 80 years ago.
Welcome back! What did you think of today's adventure? We hope you learned something new. Be sure to share the story with your friends and family, and use what you've learned today to go out there and make a positive impact on history yourself. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about important and amazing stories from the past, be sure to subscribe to Honest History Magazine, where you'll discover stories from around the world. Thanks for listening. This episode was narrated by Randall Lawrence and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Robot Pirate Media. To learn more about Honest History, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media.